On today's World Insight, a lifeline for the World Health Organization amid a pandemic, in the words of a respected medical journal editor.
But to step into the middle of a crisis and say we're going to get rid of the crisis managers doesn't make any sense at all.
A U.S. economist explains how digital contact tracing has helped manage the COVID-19 spread in East Asia. 10 others follow suit. And SEC regulations on publicly listed Chinese companies in the U.S., their impact in the long run. Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight on CGTN from Beijing. I'm Tian Wei. We begin today's program focusing on Chinese companies in the U.S. stock market. Earlier this week, Securities and Exchange Commission Chairman Jay Clayton warned investors over bookkeeping standards of foreign companies listed in the U.S., particularly from the emerging economies. Take a look at this chart. In 2015, just 5 Chinese companies were listed in the U.S. In 2018, though, the figure grew to 28. With the trade war between China and the U.S. entering its 3rd year and China hawks growing more vocal in the U.S., many wonder Chinese companies listed in the U.S. may have to prepare for more unpredictability. But what about the transparency of Chinese companies, too? So take a look at our discussion. And for more about that story, we're joined in Hong Kong with Hong Hao, Managing Director and Head of Research at Bocom International. In New York, over Skype, we have Anthony Chen, former J.P. Morgan Chase Chief Economist. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen. First of all, the SEC, Mr. Chen, issued the guidelines on Tuesday. So how should we see the details of the latest issuance? And how should we compare it to the previous ones and the guidance?
Well, I think the Securities and Exchange Commission has been talking about this for quite some time. In fact, last year, I was in Shenzhen speaking before a Chinese IPO conference as one of their keynote speakers and talked about this issue and these concerns that the Securities and Exchange Commission. Yes, we have cases of incorrect data and incorrect financial information, even from U.S. companies. So I think that it's quite clear that it's been a while that the U.S. has been complaining about the Chinese lack of data, and that's why I think that some sort of a compromise can be reached.
Right. Businesses are about compromises, but it's interesting to know where could be the grounds about compromises. Mr. Chen, what are some of the likely areas that where the compromise is likely to be reached, even about data?
Well, the Public Company Oversight Board would like to have some access to some of the audit information that comes out of Chinese companies, or really a lot more accounting information with regard to these companies, so they can value these companies a little bit better. Keep in mind that without this extra information, it means that Chinese companies listed in the United States will be sold at a discount because the financial markets, if they feel they don't have adequate information, they're not going to value the price of those shares at a fair price. So really, it's in the best interest of both the U.S. investor and also the Chinese companies to provide that information, because then it will raise the valuation of Chinese companies, and U.S. investors will feel a lot more comfortable. I do realize that it's a long way for the Chinese companies to provide the exact same identical accounting information that U.S. companies provide, and that may be a little bit of a stretch. But certainly moving in the direction of providing more information is likely to make the Securities and Exchange Commission and U.S. investors a lot more comfortable.
Right. Of course, Mr. Chen is very diplomatic in expressing the need to do it. Mr. Hong, however, you know the earlier argument, so-called the national security, data security, and the things about borders, but it is also trading internationally. So how are companies likely to keep that balance, and what is likely to be this relationship as a result between the Chinese companies, the private ones, and also the regulators in China, the regulators inside the United States?
Yeah, well, I think the SEC is concerned about unfair playing ground for some of the Chinese listed companies. basically, because of incomplete disclosure, there is the leeway for some of the companies to fix their financials is very large. And also, if something happened, the recourse for U.S. investors is very limited. And also, even if they win the judgment from the U.S. court, it's very difficult to enforce those judgments. So for that reason, I think the SEC is warning the U.S. investors. But then, having said that, though, for the longest time, I think even back in 20 years ago, actually, when the first wave of Chinese companies get listed in the U.S., for example, NetEase, Baidu, some of the biggest and best Chinese internet companies was actually listed in the U.S. exchange 20 years ago. And many of them actually rewarded the U.S. investors handsomely. Right. And many of these companies, they chose to be listed in the U.S. exchange not because they can get away with some corporate fraudulence, but because it's the fastest way for them to get listed. Because if you want to get listed in the Chinese market, you have to line up in the queue, to get through all the approval process. And also, just now, Dr. Chen mentioned that the U.S. investors are willing to give a higher valuation to companies such as this with higher growth. So I would say that, so far it has been a win-win situation. There has been some bad apples here and there. But I think overall, the picture is that the Chinese companies listed in the U.S. actually rewarded the U.S. investors handsomely over the years with some risk.
Very interesting what you just said, both of you, which lead us to the next question. Now, there are two things going on. One, we see the guidance coming from SEC and the words coming from the chairman of SEC with the big backdrop of this pandemic. A lot of uncertainties of economies around the world, and probably economy going to go down, as we all know, unfortunately, as a result of this. Secondly, there is also the huge background which have been evolving over the past 3 years about the geopolitics between China and the United States. The relationship is not likely to pick up very soon. So how should we put the context of both of this into the background of SEC chairman's words and the revision of guidelines and the debate going on inside the U.S., Mr. Chan, for example, among some of the so-called China hawks, both as Congress, both of those in the Congress and also some of those in the investment area, Mr. Chan?
Well, there are always going to be China doves and China hawks, and we know that the political relationship between China and the United States is going to be a volatile one. But the reality is that when you look at the Chinese economy and the U.S. economy, it's 40% of the global economy. So that despite the apparent tensions that we are seeing today, those tensions have to be ironed out because it's in the best interest of both the United States and China to actually reach some sort of a truce despite the tensions over time. So we know that these tensions are going to be volatile over time, and right now the tensions are at high levels. We know that there are two political parties in the United States. One political party is much more favorable to China, another political party sometimes less favorable. But over time, there's going to always be changes in political party in the United States. So those relationships are likely to go up and down.
To you, Mr. Hong, how should we read the two important contexts that I just mentioned, pandemic, geopolitics, with the words coming from SEC chairman?
Yeah, well, it's interesting times. Actually, I read through the statement this morning. It's very, very long. But I think the SEC chairman was referring to companies from the emerging markets. But then in particular, because China is the largest emerging market country, and also China's index weight in the MSCI indices is actually being increased this year and probably going to increase substantially in the years that is coming. So I think that sort of raised some of the concerns that the SEC chairman, because of the 200-odd companies that the SEC can't get information, I think over 200 of them are actually from China, right? So it's an unusually large proportion of companies that is not giving sufficient financial information for investors. And also, at a time such as this, it's very sort of a challenging and interesting times. And I think, over the past 20 years, the cooperation between U.S. and China has been a very fruitful one, and it benefited both countries and also the entire world. But then, I think, because of various reasons, and also probably because of the presidential election this year, words such as this, from the SEC chairman, that is naming some countries as a bad example, could be misused or misappropriated by people with other intentions.
Interesting. On the other hand, we have seen investors quite active and proactive, reaching out to one another. For example, recently, Schwartzman and also Neil Shen, coming from China, they've been having some very high-profile online, talk with one another as a result of social distancing now going on between countries. But they did talk about how much investors should put their money into China and Chinese companies and also Chinese market. And of course, we see quite different messages from Washington. So how can we reconcile these two different directions, Mr. Chen?
Well, I think it's quite clear, as somebody that spent over 25 years on Wall Street with a major investment bank, global diversification for investors is the right way to go. And China being as large as it is, as part of the global economy in the U.S., it really makes no sense to be able to pursue a policy that completely isolates a country that has an economy the size of China. So I think most investors know that not only being globally diversified is important, but it also it benefits the rate of return and actually ends up lowering risk. What the SEC and perhaps some investors would like is, of course, to make sure that they're able to take advantage of this global diversification with the proper amount of information. And so my hope and expectation is that more information will be forthcoming, certainly over the next 12 to 18 months.
On the other hand, Mr. Hong, if I could double down on this, how should we understand, as a result of all of this uncertainties at least, and also time to settle down on compromises both of you mentioned, what would that mean for other financial markets besides those in the United States? For example, many of those in Asia who are very desirable to have Chinese companies listed on their stock markets, and also in Europe as well, even though none of them could compete in the same scale with New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ, but still this is a very interesting question and direction many have been thinking, Mr. Hong.
Yes, I would just use Hong Kong Stock Exchange as an example. I think over the past year, we've seen actually Hong Kong Stock Exchange trying to relax some of the listing standards, to welcome back some of the Chinese companies to come listed in Hong Kong. The most notable example is Alibaba. Had a really successful return to Hong Kong, and also is performing very, very well, even though the market has been volatile in the past couple of months. So I think it's an example that not all companies listed in the U.S. are bad, with bad standard, and there's some really good Chinese companies as well. So I think, for stock exchange, is a trade-off between how easy and how attractive you want it to be as a listing ground for some of the more promising companies. Then at the same time, you want to offer investor protection for them to be able to realize those investment opportunities. So I think it's a very delicate balance, for the stock exchange to consider. But I think Hong Kong Stock Exchange seems to be taking the lead to welcome back, many of the reputable and good Chinese companies.
Mr. Chen, your thought about that too?
Well, certainly one of the things that I tell U.S. investors when they ask me, why is it that Chinese companies don't offer more information, I remind them that when the United States started allowing companies to come and list in New York exchanges with limited information. It was to attract European companies to come and list in the United States. And the United States did not require as much information on the assumption that if they qualified for listing in European exchanges like the DAX index and others, that somehow we didn't require as much information because we felt that they were properly vetted. That, of course, created the opportunity for Chinese companies to come to the United States and do the same thing. And now, all of a sudden, the United States is not so happy. But my suspicion is that if we're not happy now, we should not have been happy when we allowed the European companies to come into the United States. So this is something to keep in mind also.
This is a fascinating topic. I'm sure discussions about that and also the context in which this discussion exists will go on for some time. But for now, I want to thank both of you sharing your insights with us and pointing to some interesting directions for further observation. Anthony Chen, Hong Hao, really appreciate it. Thank you, gentlemen. And you're watching World Insights, still to come on our program today. New U.S. reveals that its first COVID-19 death occurred 2 weeks earlier than previously believed at the beginning of February. How should we interpret that? And also, Professor Ya-Sheng Huang, a U.S. economist, explains how digital contact tracing has helped manage COVID-19 spread in East Asia. Can others follow suit? We're going to have that answer. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight. We are keeping an eye on the coronavirus pandemic. The outbreak in East Asia has calmed down so far. One thing that is helping these countries monitor the spread of the virus is tracing travel information of its residents. Local governments are asking citizens to scan 2-digit codes on their phone to report their whereabouts to decide whether they should go into quarantine. Big data has many disease control applications. Professor Ya-Sheng Huang has kept an eye on these developments. As a professor of political economy and international management from MIT, he gave his opinions about collecting travel information and some privacy concerns generated by this measure. Earlier, I invited him for a detailed discussion. Take a look. Professor Huang, you've been talking about the digital contact tracing taking place in East Asia and how is it interacting with the process of COVID-19. Tell me more about how exactly it is playing a role.
Well, it is playing a very important role because digital contact tracing enables policymakers, medical professionals, and also just average people to determine and decide on the degree of their exposure, potential exposure to COVID-19, and then decide on that basis of information what to do next. It is a very, very valuable tool in responding to COVID-19.
Yeah.
And I believe that East Asian societies and countries have shown an example of how to use that technology to deal with a public health emergency.
Can you give us some examples to, in a way, demyth the practices in East Asia?
Well, it has been applied in China, in South Korea, and in Singapore. And the basic idea is that you download the app, you enter information into the app about your travel history, about your own medical and personal conditions, and then you use the Bluetooth to communicate with other people who also have the app. The big difference is that in the United States, the app is relatively limited. It is not integrated with other databases. And it relies on self-reporting completely, whereas in East Asia, the database is integrated with other types of data. The other big difference is the scale and the speed of adoption. In the United States, this is a private sector effort. It depends on voluntary opt-in by the users. So the speed of adoption and the scale of adoption is relatively limited as compared with East Asia, where you have this integration not just between different databases, but also between government and business. So the adoption rate in East Asia is much faster, and the scale is much larger.
Yeah, in a pandemic where things are happening so fast, how important is the speed?
This has to do with the fact that COVID-19 is highly contagious. And when you have such a highly contagious outbreak, essentially, if you don't have universal contact tracing, you have none of contact tracing. Even if you leave one person out, or two persons out, or three persons out, it can defeat the purpose. So nearly universal adoption, I'm not talking about 100%, but maybe 80%, 90%, is really necessary to deal with the COVID-19.
But also, it has to be balanced with a lot of different factors. For example, cultural factors. In Confucian societies, probably the tendency of accepting, states' demand is different compared to where you are in the United States. And also, there's the issue of privacy as well. How do you see privacy in a time of crisis?
Absolutely. This is an important question, and we shouldn't just emphasize one set of values at the expense of the other. But my own view is that in an emergency situation, some values are more important than other values. In a normal time, we can talk about the trade-off, which set of values we should emphasize, which set of values we can kind of put aside.
Right.
In a public health emergency situation, I believe public safety is value number one. And you have to be willing to give up on some of the privacy concerns for the sake of public safety.
Yeah, but Professor, just for argument's sake, I mean, there's a Chinese phrase which is called 事后诸葛亮, meaning everybody could be a grand strategist after everything becomes, clear. So it is a tricky thing for the policymakers, particularly in different societies and cultures, to decide at a time when not everything is clear yet, that they do not necessarily know there's likely to be a pandemic. How would you interpret this critical choice and what we could learn this time for the next time?
Well, okay, so two responses. One is that now we know this is a pandemic.
Yes.
We know this is a public health emergency. And I believe in this particular situation, we need to put privacy concerns in some proper perspective vis-a-vis public safety, right?
Yes.
The second thing I want to say is that, in fact, if you look at the countries around the world, all have thought about what you do in the case of emergency. It could be a public health emergency, it could be a military emergency, it could be some other type of emergencies. During that moment, you need to change your system in order to respond to that particular situation. In Israel, they have suspended certain individual rights to deal with COVID-19. For the United States, public health emergency has not been something that people often think about. They think about terrorism, they think about nuclear weapons and things like that. But I think we should begin to think about public health emergency as one of the most severe situations that we have to deal with.
Apart from detailed measures on tracing the spread of COVID-19, Professor Huang also mentioned some other important factors that have affected the performance on disease control in different countries. He pointed out that with the completely different economic and political experiences, what works in China may not be compatible elsewhere, and these uneven measures are affecting global efforts in combating the pandemic. Professor Huang, another thing has a lot to do with people's experiences. One, if you look at China, 2003, and some of the East Asian economies experienced the SARS, and that was a devastating situation, lives lost overnight. How much does it have to do with our past experiences of dealing with crisis? And the narrow escape from now on, how should we understand that phrase? Does it still exist anymore?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. The East Asian countries had the experience of SARS, which had a very high mortality rate, and 10% of people died. But as a result, it was not that contagious. It didn't spread to many countries. The COVID-19 has a different profile. It is more contagious. Far more contagious than SARS, but because the mortality rate is not that high, you don't have the kind of situation when many people show up in the emergency rooms in the hospital simultaneously. And that was the scenario that scared people in China during the SARS, and obviously in Wuhan during COVID-19. Western countries haven't had that type of experience, and I think that partially explains why the responses in the West have not been terribly proactive, because their instinct is this is something remote, this is something distant, this is not something that that they have to deal with.
Right. Yeah, but they should not be used as excuses not to act for now, particularly.
Definitely not for next time.
Wow. Yeah.
But I would argue that it's not just lack of experience. By now, every indicator that we have is that in January, there were already pretty solid warnings within the United States about a potentially dire situation in the United States if they didn't put in effective controls. There were voices coming from private sector, from academia, from newspapers, from one of the presidential candidates, Joe Biden. There were also warnings from within the Trump administration, and memos and briefings by the Secretary of Health, Azar, but still there were no effective actions taken by the Trump administration. So I believe that it was also a gigantic failure of leadership. It was not just lack of experience. There was all the information they needed to take actions, and they didn't.
Professor Huang, before we go, tell me more about your assessment. How is this COVID-19, as far as we know it, likely to play its role about the current thinking of globalization and the global supply chain, as well as some of the most important geopolitical relationship, including that between China and the United States?
I think we just have to accept the reality. Within the short run, the U.S.-China relations are going to be worse rather than going to be better. I'm just stating the obvious. I'm not saying anything that other people don't know. This is an election year in the United States. The Republican Party has a strategy of blaming the failures in the United States in terms of dealing with COVID-19 on China. And my own view is that whatever the issues are within China, it has nothing to do with the response, the lack of effective response by the United States. The reason is very simple. South Korea, Germany, Israel, and Hong Kong and Singapore, they all rely on the same information from China as the United States did. Right? These countries have done a pretty good job. Right? South Korea, really fantastic job.
Right.
So you cannot really blame the problems in the United States on information from China. In terms of global supply chain, the trade war has already affected the global supply chain. COVID-19 is another gigantic negative shock to global supply chain. There is going to be deglobalization. Countries are probably going back to their own economies and try to produce lots of things within their borders. I don't believe this is the right response. I believe this is a costly response to the COVID-19. I believe globalization can actually provide a solution, but it has to happen under better governance standards, under better governance norms. And so these are the two directions of the debate: deglobalization and doing globalization better and smarter. I will support the second option.
We hope that will be the case. But for now, I want to thank you for your insights and input. Professor Ya-Sheng Huang from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much, sir. Be well. Back. Let's turn to the U.S. 2 people with the coronavirus died in California as much as 3 weeks before the U.S. reported its first death from the disease in late February. That means a gap may have led to delays in issuing a stay-at-home orders in the nation's most populous state. So far, the U.S. COVID-19 cases and deaths have surpassed all other countries. Though the curve has been flattened, the challenges for the U.S. in combating the pandemic remains. So how should the world's largest economy cope with the next phase? We invited Dr. Eric Rubin, editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, for his insights from a scientist's perspective. So we invite Dr. Eric Rubin, editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine. Dr. Rubin, what a pleasure to see you once again.
Nice to see you virtually.
It's good to find you safe and sound after 1 week of heavy work in the clinic. But tell me more, Dr. Rubin. Your assessment of the latest number, both confirmed and death cases inside the United States, it seems to be quite a huge number.
It's a huge number. It's overwhelming. And it's meant that in areas where there are a lot of cases, a bit reminiscent of parts of China, it's taken over the hospital systems. So, for example, in Boston, where I am, where we do have a lot of cases, the hospitals are filled with COVID-19 patients and essentially empty of everything else.
But what does that mean? Because if you compare the number of confirmed cases in the United States and that of China, there's a huge difference. Now, how would you interpret that huge difference? Some even try to accuse the latter of giving misinformation. But what do you make of those differences?
I don't have any inside information about who did what, but it's clear that in China, the outbreak started in one city, probably a transmission event or a small number of transmission events occurring in Wuhan. And that meant that once China cracked down on Wuhan, despite the fact that several people had left, it really was a chance to control the outbreak. In the U.S., it appears that the outbreak occurred simultaneously or near simultaneously in many cities, probably by resulting from people traveling from an area that already had it to the U.S. And there were many, many introductions. There's evidence that in New York it was introduced by several different times. And much more harder to control there that way, especially at a time when there was little or no testing.
Dr. Rubin, having said that though, tell me more about what is going on with the testing, because at the very beginning, the U.S. has been talking about massive testing. Until today, what is the scale?
It depends on where you are.
Yes.
I think the availability of testing varies from place to place. We haven't had a lot of testing at the federal level, at the national level, and it's really relied on states and cities to work up the capacity to test at very large scale. That and commercial providers. The commercial providers have been scaling up, and in certain localities like San Francisco, like Boston, where there are a large academic community, the academic community has pitched in as well. But are there enough tests even in a place like Boston? No, there still aren't enough. But it has been improving, and it's much better in certain places than others. It will continue to improve. We're not where we need to be yet. A lot of testing in much of the country comes from commercial providers, and they need to get tests in place and validated and then work up their manufacturing capacity. They're doing it. It's taking a while.
Is there a timetable with which testing needs to take place so that the U.S. will be able to get on track with its productions and manufacturing and things like that?
Well, that's a slightly complicated answer. Optimally, we should have all that testing in place before we start opening up our social distancing policies. Realistically, will that happen? I'm not sure. It depends on leadership issues.
Another thing is about the PPE. I mean, you yourself work in the hospital over the past week, besides your job as the editor-in-chief of New England Journal of Medicine. So you know what was it like to be on the front line and lack of PPE. Now, on this program, I've been talking to medical workers from around the world on that issue, but U.S. seems to have a very big one still today. What happened?
I can say that it's gotten better, but it's not where we'd want it to be. We have to think about how to use our PPE better now instead of just having enough so that everyone has them all the time, anytime they want them.
Another question, Dr. Rubin. Your magazine, you yourself have been working on the story about the origin of the virus and further studies of the virus. Recently, we see the news from the state of California tracing back 2 earlier death cases. One is February the 6th, and the other is February the 17th, and confirmed as COVID-19. Now, the state of California is doing further investigation about the cases even dating back to December last year. We don't now know the result yet, but tell me more about what this could mean, because earlier the U.S. First death case was supposed to be the one in the state of Washington at the end of February. Now, we seem to move 1 month earlier than the original copy.
So I don't know any of the details of the California cases that you're talking about, not anything more than what I've read in the newspaper. It would not be surprising at all if there were introductions earlier than the one in Seattle. I just don't find that surprising. What it means is that those introductions didn't result in big clusters and a lot of transmission, though. Otherwise, we would have seen that because we would have seen those outbreaks. But it's certainly true that there's a lot of disease out there that we're missing. We already talked about asymptomatic infection, which is probably happening at reasonably high rates. In fact, the few spots that it's been looked at in the U.S., for example, around here in nursing homes, if you go in and find cases in nursing homes, people are sick, and go and test everybody, you'll find often that a majority of the residents have been infected, have current infection, and yet are asymptomatic. So we know that happens at a great rate.
And finally, before we go, there are a lot of debates about so many things regarding COVID-19 and its implications. I want to ask you a little bit between science and politics. Now, the U.S. role with the WHO is kind of tricky right now, with the president talking about temporarily halting the funding. From a scientist perspective, and as a chief editor of one of the world's most important magazine on medicine discovery. What do you make of this interesting and tricky question?
It's not that tricky. If you have a fire, you don't turn to the firemen and say, "This is your fault. We're cutting off all your pay." And this is precisely that case. But to step into the middle of a crisis and say we're going to get rid of the crisis managers doesn't make any sense at all.
As simple as that. Eric Rubin, Editor-in-Chief of the New England Journal of Medicine. Thank you so much, sir, always for your insights and input.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Eric Rubin, Editor-in-Chief of the New England Journal of Medicine. And that will do it for this edition of World Insight. To find out more, you can always search us, World Insight, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook accounts. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching.